The story of Pedro Blanco is the story of how the slave trade adapted, mutated, and thrived, even after it was officially outlawed. Because here's what most people don't understand about the 19th century Atlantic slave trade. After Britain abolished the trade in 1807, after the United States did the same, after most European nations signed treaties promising to end this commerce in human flesh, the trade didn't stop. It went underground. It became more brutal, more profitable, and more sophisticated. And no one embodied this transformation better than a Spanish merchant who turned a remote river delta in Sierra Leone into the single most important illegal slave depot in West Africa. Pedro Blanco was born in 1795 in Malaga, Spain, in the fishing neighborhood of Il Perchel. His origins were humble. His father was a small-time boat captain who died before Pedro was born. His mother came from a wealthier family of bureaucrats, but was ostracized after becoming pregnant out of wedlock. Young Pedro's childhood was marked by scandal and violence. According to Spanish historical accounts, at age 14 he was forced to flee Malaga after impregnating his own sister, Rosa, a crime that would have destroyed what little status his family possessed. He stowed away on a ship, and for the next several years lived the rough life of a sailor in the Atlantic world. This wasn't unusual for the time. Thousands of young men with no prospects, no connections, no future in their home countries found themselves aboard ships crossing the Atlantic. Some became sailors, some became merchants, some became pirates. Pedro Blanco would become something else entirely. By his early 20s, Pedro Blanco had made his way to Cuba, which by the early 19th century had become the sugar capital of the Caribbean. The island's planters had an insatiable appetite for labor. Cuban sugar production was booming, expanding into new territories, consuming enslaved workers at an alarming rate. And after 1820, when Spain officially prohibited the importation of new slaves into its territories, that appetite only grew more desperate, more willing to pay premium prices for illegal human cargo. Blanco ran a sugar mill in Cuba for a time, learning the economics of plantation agriculture from the inside. He saw firsthand how the system worked. He understood the brutal calculus of sugar production, how many workers were needed to clear land, plant cane, harvest it, process it in the mills. He understood the mortality rates, how quickly people died under the crushing workload and tropical diseases. He understood that plantations were constantly needing fresh labor, that the system literally consumed people and required constant replenishment. And he recognized an opportunity. He understood exactly what planters needed and what they would pay for. And sometime around 1822, he sailed to Africa aboard his own ship, the Conquistador, to enter the illegal slave trade. The location he chose was brilliant in its strategic value. The Galinas River, located on the coast of what is today Sierra Leone, near the border with Liberia, was one of the most remote and inaccessible places on the West African coast. The river mouth was a maze of mangrove swamps and shifting sandbars. Large naval vessels, the kind the British Royal Navy used to patrol for illegal slavers, couldn't navigate the shallow, treacherous waters. Small canoes could slip in and out, invisible to the warships patrolling offshore. It was the perfect place to build an illegal empire. The remoteness that made it difficult for naval patrols to access also made it difficult for legitimate commerce to reach. But Blanco wasn't interested in legitimate commerce, and that's exactly what Blanco built. He called it Lomboko. Not a single fortress, but a complex scattered across several small islands at the mouth of the Galinas River. Each island served a specific purpose in his operation. One island held his storehouses packed with the goods he used to trade with African merchants. Textiles from Europe and India, alcohol, tobacco, guns. Enormous quantities of all of these things, stockpiled and ready to trade. Another island held his office, the administrative center where he conducted his business, kept his records, managed his accounts. This wasn't some rough pirate operation. Blanco ran Lomboko like a corporation, with careful bookkeeping, regular correspondence with his agents and partners, detailed inventories. A third island contained houses for his multiple African wives and concubines. Blanco, like many European slave traders who spent years on the African coast, had formed relationships with local women. Some forced, some transactional, some perhaps voluntary, in the limited sense that any relationship with such enormous power imbalances can be voluntary. These relationships served multiple purposes. They provided Blanco with domestic comfort, with children who tied him to local communities, and with information and connections that helped his business. And two islands, Taro and Kamasan, served as the barracoons, the holding pens where enslaved people awaited shipment across the Atlantic. These weren't the massive stone dungeons of the older slave forts further north on the Gold Coast. Those had been built during the era when the trade was legal, when European powers maintained permanent fortifications. Lomboko's barracoons were different. They were made of wood and local materials, structures that could be quickly built and, if necessary, quickly abandoned or rebuilt if the British attacked. But they were large, very large. The scale of the operation was staggering. Historical accounts suggest that Lomboko's barracoons could hold 5,000 people at any one time. 5,000 human beings, imprisoned on these islands, waiting in conditions we can barely imagine. Packed together in sweltering heat, insufficient food and water, disease spreading rapidly in the crowded conditions. Gruesome stories circulated along the coast about what happened at Lomboko. Systematic violence, starvation as a control mechanism, casual brutality as standard operating procedure. People were beaten, starved, terrorized into submission. The complex of buildings, mostly rough wooden barracoons that could be quickly abandoned if British warships approached, became one of the most dreaded places in West Africa. People throughout the interior knew about Lomboko by reputation. It was where you disappeared if you were captured or sold. It was the last place you saw Africa before being loaded onto a ship for the Middle Passage. Blanco's business model was ruthlessly efficient. He established a working relationship with the local African ruler, a man named King Siaka of the Vai people. This partnership was crucial to understanding how the slave trade actually functioned in the 19th century. We often imagine Europeans simply raiding African villages and kidnapping people. Sometimes that happened, but more often the trade depended on African intermediaries like King Siaka. Siaka controlled the interior territories behind the coast, and his warriors conducted raiding expeditions to capture people who would then be sold to Blanco. Blanco provided Siaka with guns, training his soldiers in European military tactics and firearms use. He also traded rum, wine, tobacco, and salt. This partnership made both men wealthy and powerful. Under one of the trees at Lomboko, Blanco set up a canopy to protect himself from the tropical sun while he conducted his transactions with Siaka. Guns for people. That was the exchange rate. That was the currency of this particular hell. The dynamic was almost feudal. Siaka would arrive with captives, people his warriors had seized in raids, people sold to him by other African merchants, people given to him in payment of debts. Blanco would inspect them, make offers, negotiate prices. Then the transaction would be completed. Siaka would leave with European goods, primarily firearms that he would use to conduct more raids and consolidate more power. Blanco would take possession of human beings who would be imprisoned in his barracoons until enough had accumulated to make loading a ship worthwhile. But Blanco's operation extended far beyond Galinas. He eventually had agents stationed all along the West African coast: Cape Mount, Shabar, Digby, Nuevo Sestos, and other strategic locations. These agents gathered intelligence about available human cargo, arranged purchases, coordinated shipments. They served as Blanco's eyes and ears, monitoring British naval movements, identifying opportunities, facilitating the complex logistics of the illegal trade. It was a sophisticated commercial network, a multinational corporation built on trafficking human beings. Some of these agents were Spanish or Portuguese. Others were mixed-race individuals who moved between European and African worlds. Still others were Africans who had learned to speak European languages and understood European commercial practices. In Havana, Blanco entered into a partnership with a man named Lino Carballo. Together, they established a true transatlantic enterprise with branches in Puerto Rico, Trinidad, and even the Republic of Texas. Think about that for a moment. The Republic of Texas, which would eventually become part of the United States, had slave traders operating there as part of Pedro Blanco's network. Their operation supplied enslaved Africans to plantations throughout the Caribbean, in Brazil, and in the United States. The demand was enormous. Cuba alone needed thousands of new workers every year to feed its expanding sugar industry. Brazilian coffee plantations were equally hungry for labor. And in the American South, despite the official prohibition on importing slaves after 1808, there was always a market for human cargo. Always planters willing to pay premium prices for fresh workers smuggled in from the Caribbean. What's remarkable, what tells us everything we need to know about how deeply embedded the illegal slave trade was in supposedly respectable commerce, is that Pedro Blanco's credit was good everywhere. His bills of exchange, essentially promissory notes, were enthusiastically accepted in New York City, in London, in financial centers throughout the Atlantic world. Think about what that means. Banks and merchants in the great capitals of the Western world, in cities where the slave trade had been officially outlawed, where politicians gave speeches about the evils of slavery. These same institutions happily did business with one of the most prolific illegal slave traders in the world. They knew what he did. Everyone knew what he did. But money has a way of making people look the other way. Blanco's promissory notes were backed by the sugar being produced in Cuba, the coffee being produced in Brazil, the cotton being produced in the American South. All of it depended on enslaved labor. All of it was connected. You couldn't participate in legitimate Atlantic commerce without, in some way, being complicit in the slave trade. The systems were too intertwined. By 1839, approximately 2,000 enslaved people per year were passing through the Galinas River, despite the fact that the slave trade was illegal under British, American, Spanish, and Portuguese law. 2,000 people every single year, flowing through Blanco's operation. Over the course of a decade, that's 20,000 people. Over Blanco's 16-year tenure at Galinas, the numbers become almost incomprehensible. Historian Hugh Thomas, in his comprehensive history of the Atlantic slave trade, called Pedro Blanco the Rothschild of slavery, comparing his financial influence in the illegal slave trade to the legendary banking family's dominance of European finance. The comparison was apt. Blanco didn't just traffic in human beings. He financed other slave traders. He provided credit to ship captains. He served as a banker for the entire illegal slave trading economy of the region. His influence extended far beyond the people who passed directly through Lomboko. The Amistad Africans, whose story would become one of the most famous episodes in the history of slavery, passed through Lomboko in 1839. Most of them, including the revolt's leader Sengbe Pierre, were held in Blanco's barracoons for approximately 2 months. 2 months of waiting, not knowing when or if they would be loaded onto a ship, not knowing if they would survive the voyage, not knowing what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. Sengbe himself had been captured in January 1839 while working his rice fields. He was married with children, the son of a local chief. After being kidnapped, he was marched for a month through the interior before arriving at the coast and being sold to Pedro Blanco's operation at Lomboko. Every day of that month-long march, Sengbe moved further from his home, further from any possibility of escape, deeper into the machinery of the slave trade. The stories the Amistad Africans later told in American courts provide us with rare first-hand testimony about conditions at Lomboko. They testified about being kept naked, about the violence, about watching people die and their bodies disposed of. A young girl named Margru testified that her father had given her as collateral for a debt, and when he couldn't pay, she was sold into slavery, eventually ending up at Lomboko, where she never saw her mother or brother again. Another girl named Teme testified that men broke into her house at night and seized her, her brother, and her mother. She too ended up at Lomboko and never saw her family again. Another man, Grabo, testified that he had been kidnapped by 4 men while walking near his village. His captors bound his right hand to his neck and marched him for days to the coast. These weren't abstractions. These were real people with real stories, and their testimonies in American courtrooms gave faces and voices to the thousands of others who passed through Lomboko without leaving any individual record. In April 1839, the Portuguese slave ship Tacora arrived at Lomboko and loaded approximately 600 people, including the future Amistad rebels. They were packed into the hold in conditions designed to maximize cargo while minimizing the space each person occupied. Chained in half-seated, half-lying positions, whipped if they refused to eat, subjected to every degradation imaginable. The holds of slave ships were designed for this. Low ceilings so people couldn't stand. Platforms creating multiple levels so more bodies could be packed in. Minimal ventilation. No sanitation facilities. People lived in their own waste, in stifling heat, in darkness, for weeks or months depending on weather and ocean currents. Those who died during the Middle Passage were simply thrown overboard. By the time the Tacora reached Cuba in June, perhaps 500 of the original 600 had survived. 100 people dead in less than 2 months. That was considered an acceptable loss rate in the illegal trade. In fact, it was probably better than average. But here's a crucial detail. By the time the Amistad Africans passed through Lomboko, Pedro Blanco himself was no longer there. In 1838, after 16 years building his empire at Galinas, Blanco left Africa. He returned to Cuba, then traveled to Barcelona. But he left behind a network of employees, agents and partners who continued operating the business in his absence. Lomboko kept functioning. The ships kept coming. The people kept being loaded into holds and transported across the ocean. Blanco had built a system that could operate without him. He had trained subordinates, established protocols, created a self-sustaining operation. That's what made his empire different from smaller-scale slave traders. It was institutionalized. It was a business with systems and procedures that transcended any individual. According to legend, when Blanco left Africa after 15 unbroken years at Galinas, he was laden with gold. His fortune was rumored to be near $1 million. In today's money, adjusted for inflation and purchasing power, that would be an almost incomprehensible sum. One of the wealthiest men in the Atlantic world, and he'd made every penny by buying and selling human beings. The profits in the illegal slave trade were enormous precisely because it was illegal. The risks drove up prices, but demand was inelastic. Planters needed workers regardless of the cost, so they paid premium prices, and those prices made men like Blanco fantastically wealthy. In Cuba, Blanco attempted to transition into respectability. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in the history of slavery and the slave trade. People make fortunes through brutal means, then try to use that wealth to buy legitimacy, to become respectable members of society. Blanco tried to use his wealth and connections to secure a position in the Spanish colonial administration. On April 30th, 1843, he was granted the title of Intendant of the Navy by the Spanish government. This was a significant administrative position, one that would have given him official status and legitimacy. But this appointment was revoked on February 27, 1844. Partly because of a scandal involving his participation in what was called the Conspiracy of the Slavers against the Spanish Captain General of Cuba, but also because of reports about his scandalous private life. The respectable Cuban planter class that had enriched itself through Blanco's services now rejected him. He was useful when he was in Africa shipping them workers, but in Havana he was an embarrassment. He knew too much. He represented the violent origins of their wealth, and they wanted that history buried, not walking around their drawing rooms. Meanwhile, the British Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron, dedicated to suppressing the illegal slave trade, was intensifying its efforts. The British had over 20 warships patrolling the West African coast by the 1840s, more than any other nation committed to stopping the illegal trade. In December 1840, British warships attacked Lomboko, freed the enslaved people they found there, and burned Blanco's factories to the ground. But slave traders rebuilt. The profits were simply too enormous, the demand too insatiable. Within months, new barracoons were constructed, the business continued. The British attacked again, and again. These weren't just naval bombardments. They were amphibious assaults with Royal Marines landing on the islands, fighting their way through whatever defenses the slavers had erected, liberating people from the barracoons, and then systematically destroying every building, every structure that could be used to house human cargo. The most significant attack came in 1849. By this point, the Amistad case had become internationally famous. The successful revolt, the trials in the United States, the ultimate vindication of the Africans' right to their freedom, all of this had focused attention on the illegal slave trade, and specifically on Lomboko, which had been identified in testimony as the origin point for the Amistad captives. Captain Peter Fitzgerald led a Royal Navy squadron to Galinas. Royal Marines stormed the islands, overwhelmed the slave traders and their guards, freed the captive people they found in the dungeons and barracoons, and then bombarded the entire complex until it was nothing but ruins. This time, they made sure Lomboko couldn't be rebuilt. They destroyed not just the buildings, but the infrastructure. They made it clear that any attempt to resume operations would be met with immediate military force. Pedro Blanco wasn't there to see his empire destroyed. He'd already left Cuba for Europe, eventually settling in Genoa, Italy. His business had collapsed in 1848 due to sustained military pressure from the British. But even in exile, sources suggest he continued to trade in slaves, using the network of agents and contacts he'd built over decades. You don't walk away from that kind of operation easily. The connections, the business relationships, the financial infrastructure, all of that persisted even after Lomboko itself was destroyed. Slave ships still needed human cargo. Planters still needed workers. The demand didn't disappear. And there were still people willing to supply that demand, even if they had to do it from exile, operating through intermediaries and cutouts. Blanco died in 1854 in Genoa, though some sources claim he died in Barcelona. One Spanish historical account suggests he died insane, his mind finally giving way after years of the brutal violence that had been his daily business. Whether that's true or just a moralistic embellishment added by later historians, we can't know for certain. He was 59 years old. He left behind no monuments, no respectable legacy, just a trail of devastation stretching across the Atlantic. But let's talk about what that devastation actually looked like. Let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers matter. From 1822 to 1838, for 16 years, Pedro Blanco operated at Galinas. By 1839, his operation was moving 2,000 people per year. Even if we conservatively estimate that he moved an average of 1,000 people per year during his 16-year peak, that's 16,000 human beings minimum. Many historians believe the actual number was significantly higher, possibly exceeding 30,000 people over the course of his career. 30,000 people. 30,000 individuals with names and families and communities. 30,000 people kidnapped, imprisoned, branded, loaded onto ships, transported across an ocean in conditions specifically designed to break their spirits and their bodies. And this was one man's operation. One network among dozens operating along the West African coast. One chapter in a much larger story of industrial-scale human trafficking. The partnership between Blanco and King Siaka illustrates how the slave trade corrupted and transformed African political structures. Siaka's power was built on his relationship with Blanco. The guns Blanco provided allowed Siaka to conduct raiding expeditions deeper into the interior, to conquer rival groups, to extract people from communities that had never before been touched by the slave trade. When Blanco's European employees trained Siaka's soldiers in the use of firearms and European military tactics, they were essentially equipping him to wage war on his own people for profit. This created a terrible dynamic. Siaka needed captives to trade for guns, but he needed guns to capture more people. The trade fed on itself, creating an ever-expanding circle of violence and predation. And the effects of this predation rippled outward. Communities lived in terror of slave raids. Productive young adults, the people societies need to farm, to raise children, to build, were systematically removed. Some were captured in wars initiated specifically to generate human cargo. Others were kidnapped by roving bands of raiders. Still others, like the young girl Margru who testified in the Amistad case, were sold by family members unable to repay debts. The slave trade created incentives for every kind of violence, every kind of betrayal, every kind of social breakdown. And here's what's particularly insidious about the illegal phase of the slave trade, the phase Pedro Blanco epitomized. When the trade was legal, there was at least some pretense of regulation, some minimal standards. Ships had to be registered. Captains were licensed. There were rules, even if they were honored more in the breach than the observance. But once the trade went illegal, even those minimal constraints disappeared. Ships became more crowded, conditions more brutal. The mortality rate during the Middle Passage increased. Speed mattered more than anything. Get the human cargo across the ocean before the British could intercept the ship. Pack more people in. Move faster. Accept higher death rates as the cost of doing business. The Amistad case provides us with a window into this world. When Sangbe Pie and his fellow captives revolted aboard the schooner Amistad in July 1839, when they killed the captain and took control of the ship, when they eventually ended up in the United States, where their case went all the way to the Supreme Court, their testimony provided Americans with detailed accounts of the illegal slave trade. They described Lomboko. They described the Middle Passage on the Tocora. They described the casual violence, the systematic dehumanization, the industrial process of turning people into property. And their case became a cause célèbre among abolitionists precisely because it exposed the hypocrisy of the entire system. Here were people who had been illegally kidnapped, illegally transported, illegally sold, in violation of treaties signed by Spain and Portugal and the United States. And yet the Spanish government was demanding that they be returned to Cuba as property. The plantation owners who had purchased them in Havana were suing for the return of their investment. The entire machinery of the state was mobilizing to protect the property rights of people who had participated in an illegal trade. Former President John Quincy Adams, in his 70s by this point in his life, argued before the Supreme Court on behalf of the Amistad Africans. He won. The court ruled that the Africans had been illegally enslaved and had the right to fight for their freedom. They were released. After years of captivity, after months in American jails awaiting trial, they finally returned to Africa in 1841. They landed in Freetown, Sierra Leone, just up the coast from Galinas, and many of them eventually made their way back to their home communities. The Amistad case didn't end the illegal slave trade, but it did something important. It exposed the networks, the methods, the scale of the operation. It made people in the United States and Europe understand that the slave trade hadn't ended just because laws had been passed. It was continuing, thriving, adapting to the new illegal environment, and it put pressure on governments to take more aggressive action. The British intensification of their anti-slave trade patrols, the repeated attacks on Lomboko and other slave depots, the diplomatic pressure on Spain and Portugal to actually enforce their own anti-slave trade laws, all of this was partly a response to the international attention generated by the Amistad case. Pedro Blanco's empire didn't just fall apart because of military pressure. It fell apart because the political and economic environment that had allowed it to flourish for 16 years was finally changing. But let's be clear about what that change meant and what it didn't mean. Lomboko was destroyed, yes. The barracoons were burned, the buildings reduced to rubble. The British made sure that particular location could never be used for the slave trade again. But the slave trade itself continued for decades. Cuba didn't abolish slavery until 1886. Brazil didn't abolish it until 1888. The United States fought a catastrophic civil war partly over the question of slavery. The demand for enslaved labor didn't disappear just because one depot was destroyed or one trader went into exile. And Pedro Blanco himself, dying in Genoa in 1854, represents something important about the economics and politics of the slave trade. He made an enormous fortune. He was, for a time, one of the wealthiest men in the Atlantic world. His credit was good in the great financial centers of Europe and America. He operated with impunity for 16 years, despite the fact that what he was doing was illegal under multiple jurisdictions. He had partnerships with respectable merchants in Havana, New York, London. His operation functioned as a legitimate business, with offices, employees, regular transactions, financial instruments accepted by banks. What allowed this to happen? How does someone build an empire on illegal human trafficking and have his bills of exchange accepted in London? The answer is that the economic structures of the Atlantic world were so deeply dependent on enslaved labor that even after the trade was officially prohibited, the financial and commercial networks that sustained it remained intact. The banks that financed slave voyages were the same banks that financed legitimate trade. The merchants who dealt in slaves also dealt in sugar, coffee, tobacco, all the commodities produced by enslaved labor. The ships that transported human cargo also transported legal goods. You couldn't separate the illegal trade from the legal economy because they were fundamentally intertwined. When we try to understand the persistence of the slave trade into the 19th century, we have to understand men like Pedro Blanco. Not because he was uniquely evil, though what he did was certainly evil, but because he was typical. He represented the logical evolution of the slave trade under conditions of illegality. When something is legal, it can be regulated, however inadequately. When it goes underground, it becomes more brutal, more efficient, more adaptable. Blanco's genius, if we can use that word for something so monstrous, was recognizing that illegality created opportunities. The British Royal Navy couldn't be everywhere at once. Remote, inaccessible locations like the Galenas River Delta offered protection. The enormous profit margins made the risks acceptable. And the continuing demand for enslaved labor in Cuba, Brazil, and the United States meant there would always be customers willing to pay premium prices for illegal human cargo. The Lomboko complex, scattered across its islands, designed to be quickly abandoned if necessary, built with local materials that could be replaced, this was the physical embodiment of how the illegal slave trade adapted to survive. It wasn't a permanent fortress of stone and brick like the older slave forts on the Gold Coast. It was temporary, disposable, designed for quick abandonment and rebuilding. When the British destroyed it in 1840, it was rebuilt. When they destroyed it again in 1849, more thoroughly this time, it stayed destroyed not because the buildings were gone, but because the political and military pressure had finally become too intense, the costs too high, the risks too great. Pedro Blanco's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the 19th century. This was the great century of abolition, when European nations and the United States congratulated themselves for ending the slave trade and eventually slavery itself. Parliaments passed laws, treaties were signed, naval squadrons patrolled, and all of that was real, all of that mattered. But it coexisted with the continuation of the trade on a massive scale. The same decades that saw the formal abolition of the trade also saw, in places like Cuba and Brazil, the largest influx of enslaved Africans in their history. The trade didn't end in 1807 when Britain abolished it, or in 1808 when the United States did. It went on for another 80 years in some places, and even after it ended, the effects reverberated for generations. The people who passed through Lomboko, who survived the barracoons and the Middle Passage, who ended up on plantations in Cuba or Brazil or the United States. They had children who were born into slavery, grandchildren who grew up enslaved, families whose bondage might continue for decades, even after no new people were being brought from Africa. The descendants of those people are alive today, primarily in the Caribbean and the Americas, carrying with them the legacy of that historical crime. And the region where Lomboko once stood, the Galinas coast of Sierra Leone, what happened to it after the slave trade ended? It was left devastated. The historian who visited in the early 2000s reported that nothing much had changed since the 19th century. No significant economic development, no infrastructure. The slave trade had extracted the region's most valuable resource, its people, for generations. And when it ended, when the last barracoons were destroyed and the slave traders left, the region was simply abandoned. The labor that built Cuba's sugar industry, Brazil's coffee plantations, the American South's cotton empire, that labor came from places like Galinas. The wealth generated by that labor flowed everywhere except back to the places the people came from. That's part of Pedro Blanco's legacy, too. Not just the 30,000 or more people he trafficked, not just the families destroyed, the communities shattered, but the economic and social devastation left behind in the regions where the slave trade operated. Modern Sierra Leone, one of the poorest countries in the world, carries the weight of that history. So does Liberia next door. So do all the regions of West Africa that were systematically depopulated by centuries of slave trading. When researchers went looking for Lomboko in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they found it almost forgotten. Local people knew something had happened there in slavery times, as they called it. But the specific details, the names, the stories, much of it had been lost. The physical remains of the barracoons were disappearing under vegetation and erosion. The islands themselves were shifting as the river delta changed. One historian wrote that Lomboko was now lost under water, its connection to the slave trade almost entirely forgotten. But in 2012, researchers working on a documentary about the Amistad managed to find the site with the help of local fishermen who knew the waters intimately. They found the raised soil and rotted organic material that would have been the wooden foundations of the barracoons. They found the place where Pedro Blanco had set up his canopy to conduct business with King Siaka. They documented what remained of one of the most important and terrible sites in the history of the illegal slave trade. And that's what we're left with. Physical ruins being reclaimed by nature, scattered documentary evidence in archives, the testimonies of survivors like the Amistad Africans, preserved in court records, the descendants of the people who passed through Lomboko, living their lives throughout the Americas, most of them unaware of the specific route their ancestors took from Africa to the New World, and the name Pedro Blanco, which appears in historical accounts and specialist scholarship but isn't widely known outside of those circles. There are no monuments to Pedro Blanco, no public squares named in his honor, no buildings bearing his name. He died in exile, his empire destroyed, his fortune dispersed, and that seems fitting. But we have to remember that during his lifetime, during the 16 years he operated at Galinas, he was not a pariah. He was a successful businessman whose credit was good in the world's major financial centers. He had partners and agents throughout the Atlantic world. He had relationships with powerful people in Cuba, in Spain, in the international merchant community. The hypocrisy is staggering. The same societies that had officially abolished the slave trade, that sent naval squadrons to patrol the African coast, that passed laws and signed treaties and gave speeches about the evils of trafficking in human beings. These same societies maintained the commercial and financial networks that made Pedro Blanco's operation possible. The banks that accepted his bills of exchange knew what he did. The merchants who dealt with his partners knew where the money came from. The planters in Cuba who bought the people passing through Lomboko knew they were participating in an illegal trade. But as long as the sugar kept flowing, as long as the coffee and tobacco and cotton kept being produced, as long as the profits kept rolling in, people found ways to look the other way. That's the real lesson of Pedro Blanco's story. Not that one man was uniquely evil, but that an entire economic system was structured in ways that rewarded that evil, protected it, enabled it to flourish even after it was supposedly prohibited. When we study historical figures like Pedro Blanco, we study them not to condemn individuals from 2 centuries ago, though they certainly deserve condemnation. We study them to understand how economic systems work, how violence becomes normalized, how crime becomes commerce, how profits can blind people to suffering. Because the structures that allowed Pedro Blanco to build his empire at Galinas, the international financial networks, the demand for cheap labor, the willingness of respectable institutions to do business with people involved in horrific crimes, those structures didn't disappear when the slave trade ended. Understanding how Pedro Blanco operated, how he built his network, how he adapted to illegality, how he maintained relationships with legitimate businesses while conducting an illegal trade, this helps us understand our own world. Because exploitation still happens, human trafficking still happens, illegal labor still happens, and it still happens partly because the same kinds of economic pressures, the same kinds of financial incentives, the same kinds of institutional blindness continue to operate. Pedro Blanco's story is the story of how evil scales, how it industrializes, how it becomes just another business. Lomboko wasn't an aberration. It was the logical evolution of a system designed to extract maximum profit from human suffering. And until we fully reckon with that history, until we understand not just the individual criminals but the structures that enabled them, we can't fully understand our present or build a more just future. The 30,000 people who passed through Pedro Blanco's hands weren't statistics. They were human beings whose lives were stolen, whose futures were erased, whose descendants still live with the consequences of what was done to their ancestors. That's the legacy we have to confront. That's the history we can't afford to forget.